welcome to a WEM Extra session. This is writing materials for business English. The term business English has always been slightly misleading, especially for lots of English language teachers. It suggests English for something like corporate English or complicated industrial English or increasingly technical or technology English. Perhaps a better term would be to call it English for work. And it's the type of English that our learners need, perhaps to get a job in the future, English for careers, English for employability, or English to help them with their job now. In fact, most language learners, English language learners, are learning English probably because in the future they need a job and English will be the lingua franca of the workplace. So even your students at sort of secondary level who are studying with what we might call a general English course book, and they're going to take an exam like IELTS or Cambridge, eventually they actually want English to help them with their career. So it's quite a broad term. It's also a subcategory of English for specific purposes. So English for specific purposes could be English for dentistry, English for aviation, and so on. But over the last 30, 40 years, English for business is the term that's kind of been the mainstream term. But I want you to remember throughout that it's referring to business in a very broad kind of way. But just to emphasize this message, I want to go back nearly 1,000 years. I think this is really interesting. This is a piece of material written in around the year 1415. So what's that, 800 years ago? And it's attributed by somebody called William of Kingsmill, who was actually a French teacher. And he was living in Oxford, and he wrote a book called The Handbook of Language, but it was written for French students. So it was for French people coming to do business in England, and it's one of the earliest examples of materials that we have. And what you would have had on the original page, you wouldn't have had the picture. I added the picture to illustrate it, because this is really English for the language of trading in wool, at which time Oxford was very famous. It was one of the main centres for selling wool. And on one side of the page, you would have had a conversation in French, and on the other, you would have had the translation in English. So if we're looking at the original, you would have seen this conversation in French and English. And basically, a man has arrived, and he's speaking to the man's wife, and he says, "Lady, where's your master?" And the wife said, "Well, sir, he's gone to the fair at Woodstock, which is about 10 miles from here." And Woodstock is a very beautiful village. It's still standing. It's 10 miles from Oxford, but it was traditionally a market town, and you would have gone there to sell your animals. And the man says, "Well, lady, what goods does he wish to buy or sell there?" And the lady, the wife, replies, "Sir, he has to sell there bulls, cows, oxen, calves, bullocks, old and young pigs, boars, sows, horses, mares, foals, sheep, rams and ewes, tups, lambs, kids, she-kids, asses, mules, and other beasts." So there you can see, really interesting, the very first English materials were, if you like, English for business. So actually, the materials writers of English for business, English for work, they were there right there at the beginning. That was the earliest materials that were written. We've just seen English for sheep trading or animal trading. And so it has a long history. Let's jump now to sort of 1990, and something called business English was really emerging in English language teaching. And there was a definition that was developed by a writer called Nick Brieger, very influential in business English teaching. And he basically defined business English in 3 ways. And this has influenced business English materials writing for a long time. He said you need business topics. Those topics might be anything from transportation to employment to finance and so on. Then, of course, we teach language. So we choose our topic, or we choose the topic area that we're going to write about. We need to think about the language. There's going to be specific language that helps us talk about the topic, but there's also the language of grammar, the language of pronunciation, all the things you'd expect on a general English course. And then thirdly, there's something else called communication skills. And this is kind of specific to business English in that it's presentation skills, meeting skills, negotiating skills, writing reports. So you've got language, which is what we do in general English, and then around that you've got your topic, your professional content, or whatever it is in terms of business, which you would try to relate to the student's needs. And then you've got communication skills. Nowadays, in the 21st century, we're also talking about employability skills, other areas such as empathy, the ability to listen, professionalism, resilience. Some of these terms are starting to creep into business English materials design. Intercultural understanding is very important for business students. We're not going to deal with that too much in this session. We're just going to focus on those three core aspects of topics, language, skills. Let me show you how those three things have influenced everything about business materials writing. So on the screen here, you can see the first 3 units from a business English book I was involved in. This is from Business Result Elementary. And I've chosen the elementary level because one of the myths about business English is that business English can only be taught to students once they've reached intermediate level. There was an idea that you had to have students do general English from elementary to pre-intermediate, and then they were ready to start dealing with business English. In fact, business English can be taught, if you like, right from beginner level. It's just about a shift in emphasis in terms of what you're focused on. But this is, you can see on screen the first 3 units from the contents page, Business Result Elementary, and look how they reflect the key points. So you've got business topics, jobs, products and services, location. That's the business topic aspect, and that's going to influence primarily vocabulary. So next you've got the 2 parts of the contents that are concerned with language in the sense of the way we talk about language in general English. It has a working with words feature, so it's focused on vocabulary. And then its language at work strand is the grammar. The largest aspect of this particular book is on communication skills because it has 3 strands, practically speaking, things like how to spell, how to say numbers, and so on. Business communication, saying hello, goodbye, making phone calls, and something called Talking Point, which was a feature of this book really just to give students more practice in speaking and thinking about different aspects of business. But its primary focus was on speaking. So there you see the influence of business topics, business language, business communication. And then this particular contents page, the outcomes strand was really important right at the end there in sort of orange and yellow. It's basically the outcomes. And business English, of course, the design of the materials is very much focused on what can you do by the end of the lesson. Just to take this a step further, here's a little quiz for you. In fact, there's 12 items on the left there. And you can kind of categorize those under business topics, language or communication skills. This is basically simulating what you were doing if you were planning a worksheet or you were going to write a set of materials, perhaps to create a course. You'd have to list what it was the course was going to include, but whatever you listed would come under those 3 areas. For example, number 1 is present simple. That would come under language. Number 2, presenting, comes under communication skills. Number 3, logistics, would come under business topics. Just have a look at number 4 to 12. You can pause the video if you like and just match them to one of those 3 categories. Okay, if you've paused the video, then you've had time to do your matching. I'll just talk you through the rest. Comparatives under language. Number 5, management under business topics. Number 6 actually would come under communication skills. Number 7, verb noun collocations. Collocations particularly important in business English. It would come under language. Reports would come under communication skills, writing a good report. Fashion might be a business topic. Networking would be a skill. Word stress language, and meetings communication skills. For the rest of the session, I just want to break them down into more detail and give you some examples of how this might impact your own writing of materials. And it's always useful in your mind when you're planning material for business English or English for work or English for specific purposes to consider what proportion of the material is based on the topic, what is focusing on language, what is focusing on communication skill. For example, if you were writing a book for pre-work students, say students at a university, and you wanted them to know more about the world of business, you would focus a lot on the topic, and you would focus on using texts that told them about the topic. So if your piece of material was called marketing, you might have a reading text about what is marketing, or you might use a piece of video material where somebody tells you about marketing or sales. So you're teaching them the topic. You may be writing materials for students who are already experts in marketing. They don't need you to tell them about marketing. That shouldn't be the aim of the material. Maybe they want help with their language. Maybe they'd like to be more accurate. Maybe they'd like to have a broader range of vocabulary, in which case the bulk of the material will focus on language practice. And in that sense, the material is more likely to be general English material because it's interested in helping the student develop their language level. This is quite often the case with in-work students rather than pre-work students, because they already know about their job. They know about the world of business. They don't need the material to tell them. So a larger part of the focus will be on vocabulary or grammar or pronunciation. The third area, communication skills, is often the case when, think of it in terms of, you've got students who know quite a lot about the business topic. You've got students who have quite high level English. They might be upper intermediate, advanced, but they're not good at presenting information, or they're not good at participating in meetings effectively, or they're not good at writing a report. It's useful to think of these types of skills, what we call communication skills, as these are the types of skills that are also taught to fluent speakers of English. You know, if you've grown up speaking English, you would still benefit from a course in presentation skills to help you present more effectively. So these are the skills that are not so much to do with the fact that you're learning English, they're just to do with the fact that you want to be a better communicator. Let's explore each of the three aspects in more detail. For business topics, a useful starting point is to give students a needs analysis. This is a copy of a needs analysis I created with a colleague of mine, Robert McClarty, to write a book called ETpedia Business English. It's like a resource book for business English teachers. But typically, if I was making materials that were custom designed for students, so maybe I've got a one-to-one class and I'm going to design a worksheet for that student, I probably will have carried out a needs analysis to find out what topics the student's interested in, how they communicate, and what kind of language they need. Now, what type of needs analysis you use, it doesn't matter. You can design your own. But essentially, a needs analysis is covering three things. There's three things we want to know about our student or students before we start writing. We want to know what the student communicates about. So this is business topics. Do you communicate about your products? Do you communicate about transportation? Do you communicate about IT? So that answers the topic aspect of the material. Who do you communicate with? You're thinking about the people you have to talk to or write to. Are these other people in other countries for whom English is not their first language? Are you communicating with people in the UK or the US? So you're having to listen and communicate with people whose perhaps their English is their first language. Are you dealing with customers? Are you dealing with clients? Because this will affect things like register, and it will affect the type of language you're using. Are you communicating with people internally within a very large company, or are you dealing with clients, for example, externally? And the third thing your needs analysis needs to find is, how do you communicate? Do you communicate face-to-face? Do you communicate online? Do you communicate by phone? Do you communicate in a presentation situation? It will vary. But one of the first things you might have to do as a writer is to write the needs analysis and get some answers on a form. You might meet the student face to face, but you still want the student really to write things down and find out what topics they're involved with specifically. A useful thing to do when you're researching the topics you're going to use in your materials is to ask students, what sort of topics do you read about? What kind of texts do you have to use? For example, I had a student who was interested in finance. So I asked the student if they were looking at the Financial Times, what sort of topics would they read about? So I had a student who was involved in a lot of finance, was dealing with stocks and shares. If the student said, well, I'd like to be able to read this article about oil, for example, and trends in oil, that would give me an enormous clue on the types of topics to use in my materials. Or I might say to the student, what sort of text do you have at work that you have to deal with on a daily basis in English? So I might take that text, and one of the first things I want to do is identify the type of language within the text. Now, I can use this using a text checker. On our course, we've looked at Text Inspector, but I ran this text through the Oxford Text Checker, which is Oxford University Press's text checker, and it can analyze it for me. And you'll see there that that text contains quite a lot of C1, B2 level vocabulary. It has words like benchmark, crude, barrel, rally, sword, renewed, all vocabulary that in terms of general English, we would say that's C1 vocabulary. But of course, in English for specific purposes and business English, what a C1 word is in general English is not necessarily C1 for a business English student, because for them, words like rally, sword, barrel, they might be high frequency words that they come across in their own work all the time. So your general English B2 student wouldn't know those words, but potentially your A2 level business English student might know that vocabulary. They might not know another word that we use in everyday English, but they know the word oil barrel and saw and vocabulary connected with stocks and shares. So in terms of materials design, our CFR levels don't necessarily apply when you're designing courses for English specific purposes and business English. So think carefully about that. But by finding the kinds of text that students use, you can start to identify the kind of vocabulary that your materials might need to address. Which brings us to the topic of business language. And if you look at most business English course books, there's a much greater focus on vocabulary than there is on grammar. If you pick up general English course books, quite often there's a big focus on grammar and obviously on vocabulary. But in business English or English for specific purposes, students are concerned with the vocabulary of the business topic. So in this example in front of you, this is a text about the truths and myths about selling, and then we're using the text as a vehicle to practice or check students' knowledge of certain vocabulary. Here's another example where in a teacher's book with a course, it's a photocopiable activity where there's lots of business language like under license, handmade, automated line, raw materials, assembly line, all very high level language, although it's actually being presented in a sort of B1 plus B2 level book. But basically you cut these dominoes up and then students have to match phrases like the toys are being made under license, or production is increased when demand goes up. So they're chunks of language. If you ever read Michael Lewis's The Lexical Approach, it was incredibly influential on the design of business English materials because it's so focused on collocation and chunks of language, and you find a lot of that in business English materials. You will find examples of business grammar in business English materials, like when students are talking about their everyday work. You'd obviously want to make sure that they are being reasonably accurate with the present simple, with adverbs of frequency. If you're helping them to negotiate, you might introduce conditionals. For example, if I offer you a fast delivery, will you pay me extra? Or if we give you a 3% discount, we'll also give you free delivery. So it's that sort of, you're finding business English context and then thinking about what is the grammar that fits in. But grammar is not the driving factor. You don't write your grammar syllabus first and then piece in everything around it. The grammar is dependent on whatever the topic is, and actually vocabulary has more impact because students in business can make grammar mistakes and probably get away with it a lot of the time, but they need the vocabulary to express certain ideas and talk about business content. So you tend to find more vocabulary than grammar in business English materials, but it will depend a lot on the aim of your material. Let's consider the third aspect of what I commented on earlier. After business topics and language, you've got communication skills. And this is a fairly standard list of what you'd expect on your communication skills syllabus if you're writing materials, meetings, presentations, negotiating, socializing, interviewing, giving feedback. They're all the spoken communication skills, and you will find others that students will need. Written communication skills, these tend to be taught less, but it depends on your material and the student's needs. But lots of students sometimes need help with text and short messages, longer emails, reports. Maybe they're pre-work students who need to apply for a job, so job applications. Biodata, the ability to write maybe 100 words about yourself, have become increasingly important for social media platforms like LinkedIn, or if a student's going to a conference and they have to submit a summary about who they are. Or perhaps they do online communication like writing blogs for their company. So that would come under the area of communication skills. So I said earlier, communication skills are something that can be taught to anybody. It's not just about learning English, it's learning, for example, presentation skills, the ability to deliver information well. And sometimes communication skills are integrated into the material with the grammar and the vocabulary and so on. Sometimes some books are written, or some online materials are written to help students only focus on the communication skill. This was a series that I wrote. It was on giving successful presentations, and it included video content. You can see how old it is now because the pack, it included a book and the DVD. But we made some videos basically of different presentation situations, and then we wrote materials with the video to help students focus in on the language of giving presentations. So there's not much on business topics. There is some work on language, particularly vocabulary, but the main focus is on how do you deliver a successful presentation. So there, the main focus is on those skills. Let me show you some of the typical exercises. These are taken from the book Successful Presentations, and they're quite typical of the types of activities that we give students. So in this activity, students have to put useful phrases into the parts of a presentation. So if you're looking at a presentation, you'd expect to have an introduction, you'd expect to have messages or key points in the presentation, and you'd expect to have a conclusion. Now, students aren't going to want to spend lots of time talking about grammar in these lessons. So your materials need to give them chunks of language. So we get phrases like, that's the end of my presentation. Now, today, I'd like to talk to you about all that. This brings me to my second point. A phrase like this brings me to my second point, you could unpack the grammar of that sentence or the idiomatic language. But for a student who just needs to leave the lessons and have your materials to help them create a successful presentation, they just need to know that that chunk is a phrase they can use to navigate the audience through their presentation. Here's another example. Once students have got the language they need, they then prepare their own short presentation about their own work or something that relates to their own work, and they plan it with an introduction, 3 points in their presentation, message 1, 2, and 3, and their conclusion. And they're going to make notes in that table on what they're going to talk about. After they've given their presentation, maybe to you, the teacher, or to the rest of their class, if they're in a group, maybe after the presentation, they're going to self-assess how they did in terms of the presentation. And this is another aspect of business English that's different to general English. There's a lot of self-assessment and considering your performance, not necessarily the accuracy of your English, but just did you communicate your ideas well? It's about effectiveness rather than accuracy. That idea of effectiveness over accuracy is one of the things that makes the design of your materials quite different in business English. Now, I should state it may vary. If you're writing your materials for pre-work students, you don't know what type of business they're going to be involved in the future. So they're probably going to take a broad course book, for example, like Business Result. This is the elementary one I showed you earlier. It kind of covers everything: topics, language, communication skills. It's a general all-round course, and it's the sort of thing you might use with pre-work students. If you're going to use something more specialized with the student, you're going to design your materials based on authentic materials that they use, and that's where your materials creating skills come in. You're going to take a text maybe that they use, or a video that they need to watch, or a presentation that they need to give, and you're going to turn that into a set of materials so it's tailored for their needs. Or you might be preparing material for something like this. This is one of the first books I ever wrote. It's all about the English students' needs to make telephone calls. It's really quite out of date now because our use of telephones has changed so much since this was written in 1993. But again, the whole focus of this was on the communication skill of telephoning. So you won't find much on business topics or developing students' grammar and vocabulary. It's clearly in there, but it's all subservient to making effective telephone calls. I want to finish with one final message about what makes writing business English materials different to general English materials. So much of what we do on the course in terms of materials design applies to business English. Everything we've done, heads up, heads down, the numbers of exercises, how to design exercises is the same. But other than what I've already talked about, I think the key message is that business English is very much real English. It's about getting the job done. It's about helping students in real situations. And I think this spread in front of you from a business result book, the spread is about employment, and it has a text about LinkedIn, and then it has some language development exercises on the right-hand page. But I just want to focus you in on the wording used in this book. On the starting point exercise, it's asking students to talk about business and employment using their own knowledge. What's the best way to find a new job? It's saying to the student, in your experience, what's the best way to find a new job? Is it easier or more difficult than 10 years ago? And you're drawing on the student's own expertise. Let's look at exercise 2. Are you a member of any of these social networks? Why do or don't you use them? So they're looking at a picture of Instagram, LinkedIn, Facebook, and they're saying, are you a member of them? Perhaps, is it useful for your work? Exercise 3. Do you think sites like LinkedIn make life easier for companies and people looking for the jobs? Are there any disadvantages? So again, the question is asking the students, in your real life experience, is this true? Because you've got to remember that you're writing materials for people who are experts in their own field. You may be the language expert, but they're the expert in whatever it is: English for business, English for technology, English for aviation. So we have to keep designing the material so we're asking them the question. On the other page, exercise 5, discuss with a partner what parts of the recruitment process do you find easy, more difficult? So what's their own experience of recruitment? And then in exercise 9, work with a partner, tell them about when you got your present job, talk about how you heard about it, how you applied for it, the interviews you had, why you accepted the job. The original reason I got involved in language teaching, my first job was teaching business English. The first material I wrote was material for sort of one-to-one business English students, or students who had specific needs. I taught a helicopter engineer. I taught a man who sold paint. I trained a woman who was running a branch of the Italian postal service. And the reason I was attracted to it was I could really see the real reason for those students learning English. And I loved taking the text that they used and turning them into materials, because it felt like something real. It wasn't abstract like general English. It was real English, and so the materials were using really authentic texts, and they were the starting point rather than the syllabus. So it said we need to teach present simple before past simple, before present perfect. That was secondary. The starting point was the topic, what the subject was about, the communication skills needed, and then the language supported those two things. And that's an essential difference of materials design when you're writing for business English. That's all I'm going to say for now. If you've got questions following on from this session, feel free to ask them. Think about, when you're writing your assignments on the course, think about designing a piece of material that may be businessy, maybe English for specific purposes. In some way, it's going to help target students, and have a think about this balance between topic, skills, and language, and see how it impacts on your materials design. Good luck with that.